With workers beginning to organize into these unions and with big businesses continuing to repress and overwork their workers, clashes, it would seem, were becoming inevitable between labor and big business. And the period of the 1880s and 90s was indeed a chaotic one on the labor front. We see a number of very serious strikes or clashes between workers and management during this period, which would have been front-page news at that time. It seems perhaps a little dull or mundane in the modern setting to think about clashes between workers and management. But in that era, these were incredibly significant stories and gripped the nation as they took place. The first one of note occurred in May of 1886 in the city of Chicago. And note the date, 1886. Remember that on the previous pages I mentioned the Knights of Labor begin to decline in 1886, and the AFL really begins to seize prominence in that same year. And the reason is because of this event that we know as the Haymarket Riot. The immediate setting for this event is a labor holiday, May 1st, or May Day, which in Europe and other parts of the world remains a very prominent holiday on the annual calendar. Workers typically have that day off around the world. On May 1st in 1886, the Knights of Labor, the AFL, and other groups called for a labor holiday here in the United States. And in a number of cities around the country, workers walked out of their jobs on that day. And in the city of Chicago, in a site called Haymarket Square, there was a particularly large gathering of workers. The AFL was there, the Knights of Labor especially were there, and other groups as well. Anarchists and perhaps slackers and just interested observers were all there at this gathering. Well, the exact events that sparked this riot are somewhat shrouded in mystery, but there was a huge crowd gathered at this Haymarket Square, and there were police kind of ringing the crowd and attempting to bring them under control. And someone from the crowd threw a bomb or an explosive. It blew up in the midst of the police, and 7 policemen were killed in this accident. You see their pictures rendered in the picture there below. As you might imagine, the police who were not killed or injured by that explosion unleashed their fury on the crowd, led by a man named Clubber John, the captain of the police. They charged into the crowd, rounding up people, it would seem, at random. 8 people were arrested. 5 of them were hung. 3 of them served many years in jail before finally being freed years later. This is the so-called Haymarket Riot. Now, our sense of justice from a modern perspective is that regardless of how awful a thing it is that someone threw a bomb into the police, it was only 1 person, we presume, who threw that bomb, not 8 as were arrested. And the exact involvement of the people who were arrested was, in fact, very much uncertain. The ensuing trial was very hastily done, and vengeance was unleashed upon these workers, it would seem without any clear sense of true justice. This event really sparked the beginning of the end for the Knights of Labor, who were particularly fingered as the responsible parties for the deaths of the policemen in this Haymarket riot. After the Haymarket incident, the Knights of Labor will decline dramatically, and as we will see, in short order become almost a bad word in the country. To be part of the Knights of Labor was to be linked to cop killers and anarchists and troublemakers. An even more dramatic clash between labor and big business occurred in 1892 in one of Andrew Carnegie's steel plants in Homestead, Pennsylvania. This was known as the Homestead Strike. Now, at the time of this incident, Andrew Carnegie himself was out of the country. He was over in Europe, and the plant was left in the charge of his right-hand man, whose name was Henry Clay Frick. Frick was a fairly well-known big businessman during this period. Workers in the plant were growing agitated about wages and hours and conditions, and Henry Clay Frick, perhaps out of frustration, decided he had had enough of these workers and shut down the plant, locking out the workers. Well, of course, he had to keep his plant running, and so Frick set about to bring in squads of what we would call scab workers or replacement workers. And so the scene at Homestead grew to be increasingly tense as the original workers who have been locked out by Henry Clay Frick gather around the outskirts of the plant. And now the new workers or replacement workers struggle to get into their jobs in the plant because they had to run this gauntlet, and they literally did run a gauntlet. They were beaten by these workers who came in wielding axe handles and so on. And so this came to be a very intense war between the locked out workers and the scabs as the days went on trying to get in. Well, this episode peaked on July 6th of 1892 when the governor of Pennsylvania sent an army of 8,000 troops to break up this battle between the locked-out workers and their replacements. A number of workers were killed. The army attacked the workers who had been locked out. They would get no justice out of this. And the episode was described in the papers as, quote, the most unfortunate day in the history of organized labor in the United States. Now, Henry Clay Frick was viewed negatively by many in the aftermath of this, but his reputation was soon to be restored. The footnote to this event comes a couple of weeks later when a disgruntled worker broke into Frick's office and shot him in the neck as he sat at his desk. Frick somehow struggled to his feet and managed to subdue his attacker, holding him at bay until the authorities could arrive. And so in the aftermath, even Henry Clay Frick comes to be something of a hero in the aftermath of this event. And so we see the upshot of this is that the Homestead strike, like we saw previously, was held against workers, and workers don't gain anything out of this event. A final example of these very dramatic and significant clashes between workers and management came in the Pullman strike of 1894. Now, there was a significant change between Homestead in 1892 and Pullman in 1894, and that is that in 1893, a severe depression set in across the country. This was known as the Panic of 1893, and lasted throughout much of the 1890s, and according to many was the most severe depression in the country prior to the Great Depression of the 1930s. And so, as you can imagine, wages are declining, conditions are worsening for workers, and many people are, in fact, going hungry and really struggling to get by. All of that is the backdrop for the Pullman strike. This occurs in the town of Pullman, which is not far from Chicago. This was a company town. The factory there in Pullman was so significant that an entire town was built up around it to house and satisfy the workers who worked there. Pullman was a railroad car company. They built many of the passenger cars, and so this was a very significant business in the country at that time, something akin to the automobile industry today. It was a hugely important business. With the Depression setting in and worsening by 1894, management in Pullman began to raise prices in the company store, and also began to cut wages of the workers. Now, the situation for workers living in a company town like this is they had no options as far as where they could go to get their supplies and do their shopping. They were lucky to have jobs at all, and so as their wages are falling and prices are rising, their condition worsens. To the point of desperation, the Pullman workers eventually walked out on strike in the spring of 1894. Now, this strike is a little different from previous ones because it strikes in such an important industry, the railroads, and ultimately it becomes a national strike, organized by a man named Eugene Debs, Eugene V. Debs, who later ran for the presidency 4 times in this country. He organized a national strike among railroad workers, and so this became a real crisis across the country. Eventually, the President of the United States, Grover Cleveland, ordered federal troops to once again crush the strike. And you see in the picture there, federal troops riding in, and eventually they attack the workers who are out on strike. And as we've seen in our previous examples, the workers get nothing out of this. They are defeated at the end of this episode. That's an important theme and one we will emphasize over the next couple of slides, but something to bear in mind that on the whole, the experience of workers during this period is that they usually are defeated in these kind of clashes and come away gaining nothing. So let me again just summarize a couple of the themes that we see in organized labor during this period. Again, the overarching theme is that big business during this era is favored over the workers, over labor. As we've seen, the federal government was inclined to support big business and favor them, and workers weren't able to strike quite the right chord to find success during these strikes and labor clashes during this time. One of the reasons that unions struggled during this period was because it was difficult to bring together so many different kinds of workers and kinds of people behind a common cause. And what we began to see was many of the unions beginning to crumble from within or suffer because of ethnic division and ethnic diversity. There was a tremendous amount of racism in the country during this period, and you see that reflected in the cartoon here, directed specifically at Chinese workers. The suggestion in the cartoon is that Chinese workers had their hands in every industry, while off to the side we see good American workers kind of left out in the cold. Now, this was hardly the case. There were such a small number of Chinese immigrants during this period, they couldn't possibly have had such a dramatic effect on the economy. But that was the tone of the time. It was difficult for unions to remain unified because of ethnic divisions. It wasn't only the Chinese that suffered with this. All kinds of different ethnic groups had rivalries with each other. And I think the words of one Irish woman sum up the difficulties that the unions had in sticking together. She said, "There should be a law to give a job to every decent man that's out of work, and another law to keep all them Italians from coming in and taking the bread out of the mouths of honest people."